Hello everyone, Coach Chris with WolfMoon Brewing. Today we're going to do a full extract kit with specialty grains using a full quantity boil. It's a mouthful, but we'll get through it and it'll make sense as we go along. So let's get started with what's in the kit. Got the kit from Northern Brewer. It's an Obi-Ron's wheat kit. Inside the kit we have our instructions. We have a bag of specialty grains and a muslin bag, and I'll show you what we're going to use that for in a little bit. Got 1 pound of Golden Light dry malt extract, 2 containers of wheat malt liquid extract. The reason for that is they get added at separate times. And we've got 4 ounces of hops. We've got 1 ounce of Centennial, 1 ounce of German Hersbrucker, and 2 ounces of Czech Saaz. That's in the kit. Let's get started. The first thing we need to do is take our yeast out of the refrigerator. For this, I'm using Yeast 1272 American Ale 2. It's one of the recommended yeast by Northern Brewer on this kit. So we're going to take it out of the fridge. Yeast has what's called a smack pack in them. And basically it's a nutrient pack to start activating the yeast. So if you kind of shake it a little bit, and you can feel that smack pack down in the bottom here. And now all we want to do is give it a nice smack or two. Make sure it's open. Squish it around a little bit. Give it a shake. And now during the rest of the brewing process, we're just going to let that sit and activate and get up to room temperature. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to get a pot of water. I've got just about 5 3/4 gallons of water in that pot. That is filtered water. I've filled that. I've measured it by using a ruler. And based on the diameter of my pot, I know that if I put in, as to my little handy chart here that I've created, 12.4 inches, I have 5.75 gallons. So that's a little bit higher than that. I've got about 12.5 inches in there. So I've got between 5.75 and 6 gallons of water. I'll link that website that I found that will give you that calculation. So you can do that with your pot, not have to sit there with 1 gallon jugs or pint measuring cups to get your measurement. We're going to get that water up to 160 degrees. Once we get that water to 160 degrees, we're going to take our specialty grain, put it in our muslin bag, and put it in the warm water and let it sit. We're going to basically create a tea with it. That's how we're going to use our specialty grains. I'm going to crank up the heat on my water, and once I get up to temperature, we'll be right back. All right, we're back, and we're at 160 degrees by my quick read thermometer, so we're good. In the interim, what I've done is I've gotten a small pot, put it to the side here, and I'm going to show you why in a second. We're going to prep our grain, our specialty grain. Little trick, take the muslin bag that came in the kit and put it inside of a cup like this so that it's got a nice opening on it and you can pour your grains into it nice and easily. Northern Brewer is nice enough to give you bags with pull tabs in them. Pour your grain in. Now, that's only a half a pound of grain as per their instructions, so you can do that by hand, but sometimes you're going to have a kit that's going to have multiple pounds of grain, and it's much easier if you have this bag into a cup or something to hold it. All right, what I like to do is I tie a string around it, tie the string below the knot, double knot it, triple knot it, make sure it's good and tight and secure. And first, before we put that into the solution, I'm going to take approximately a gallon of liquid using my measuring cup and put it into this pot. Later on, after we've let this grain soak for 30 minutes, we're going to rinse the grain, and we're going to use this water to rinse it. You don't have to be precise on this. You just want about a gallon. So for me, that's 4 of those. Okay. Now notice I used my waterproof gloves. Make sure you have something that is 160 degrees. That will burn you. Okay. Now I'm just going to use a metal spoon. You can use anything that will fit over the top of your boil pot. Then I just put my grain bag in there and using this string, because I don't want it to sit on the bottom, I just tie it on the spoon. A couple of loops around the handle is usually good enough. I'm just going to let that sit. Now we're going to let that sit for 30 minutes. So I'm going to turn on my timer. Start 30 minutes. Okay. I'm going to put a second timer on just because that screen started flashing a little at me, so I'm not real confident. There we go, 30 minutes. So we're going to let that steep in that hot water for 30 minutes. Now, to keep that temperature, obviously that water is going to cool. If you have an old towel around, you can throw a towel over the top of it. Very carefully, make sure you don't knock the spoon over. And that'll help keep the temperature relatively close. You want to keep it between 150 and 160 for this 30 minutes. As you can see, I'm outside in my garage today using my propane burner and my 8-gallon pot to do this process. If you don't have a pot large enough and you're still doing this on your kitchen stove, you absolutely can do that. Take your 5-gallon pot or whatever size pot you're using and scale down the amount of water that you're using in the very beginning. In this case, if say you're using a 5-gallon pot, I'd put about 3.5 gallons of water in there, bring it up to 160 degrees. Take out about a half a gallon, put in your specialty grains, let it sit for 30 minutes, and then afterwards their process will be the same up until the point when we cool this and get this to go into our fermenter. And when we get to that point, I'll show you the difference then. So for now, we'll be waiting for 30 minutes for that. During this time, I'm going to start prepping and cleaning all of my gear for future use. We'll be right back. Okay, a couple of things before the grain is done steeping in the hot water. One, always make sure you document what you're doing. Perfect example was here. The timer that I had set actually did die. The battery failed on it. So luckily I do have my watch going as a second timer, but I did document what time I started the steeping. So if that does happen, I can just look at a clock and add 30 minutes and go from there. I took our 2 containers of liquid malt extract, removed the interior liner in them, and put them in a bucket here with hot tap water. Soften them up, making them easier to pour as we need them. Okay, we're all set. The grain has steeped for 30 minutes. So now we are going to take the grain out and we're actually going to rinse the grain. And this is where this extra bucket of water comes in handy. Now I did have a lid on it. I've got a straining basket. So first off, we're just going to take the grains, let them drip for a second. Put them in there. And then put the basket into our boil pot. Now that basket for me barely sits on the edge. So to avoid it from falling in, I'm just going to put a couple of clamps on it. I'm going to take my heat resistant gloves and I'm going to slowly pour this over the grain. And basically we're going to rinse the grains and try to get the last bit of sugars, flavorings, and coloring out of this grain. You don't want any of it to be thrown away. Okay. So that's been dumped in. We take our grain and we're just gonna give it a second to drip completely. Do not squeeze this grain bag. Squeezing the grain bag can release tannins. That will be some off flavors later on. So to avoid that, I just don't squeeze my bag at all and just let it drip. And then once the drip slows down, we'll get rid of it. Most of it's out, put it in that bucket. Take our strainer, get rid of that since we don't need that anymore. And now we're going to bring this to a boil. So you guys don't need to sit here and watch water boil. We'll bring this to a boil. Once it gets to a boil, we'll be right back. All right, as you see, we got it back to a boil. While this was getting up to a boil, I added a product called Fermcap. 12 drops of Fermcap. What Fermcap does is it helps break down the foam so that it aids in the prevention of boilovers. Also, it will help during fermentation to avoid huge amounts of foam and possibly bursting through the top of your fermentation vessel and causing a mess as well. So it's a product that's optional. It's not something you have to use. I do recommend if you have a pot that you are right near the top of while you're boiling, it definitely will help. It will help keep the chances of a boil over to a minimum, and then you don't have to watch it as much as a hawk. You still have to watch it. Just because you have Fermcap doesn't mean you can walk away from a boiling pot. Okay, so now that it's got to a boil, we're going to take it off of the stove, or in my case, off of the propane burner. Putting on my heavy-duty gloves again. And now that it's off the burner, we're going to add our dry malt extract. As it's going in, we're going to stir it so it doesn't clump up, doesn't settle on the bottom, and doesn't cause a mess. Now, as you're adding this, keep an eye on it. As you can see, it's starting to foam a little. It can foam up tremendously and actually boil over the top of the pot if you're near the top already. As you can see, there's some material left on the edge of the bag from the steam rising. You can quickly dip the bag in to get that material out. You don't want to just dump the bag in there and leave it. Got most of that out. Now we're going to take only one of these containers of your liquid malt extract and actually put a glove on. We're going to pour that into the boil pot as well. Again, stirring the entire time. Make sure it's well mixed in there. And again, keeping an eye on it. Make sure it doesn't boil over on you or foam over on you, because it's not really a boil anymore. Now, even though I had it in warm liquid, and it is rather warm out here today, there's still quite a bit of liquid in there, so get a little bit of the hot water in there, slosh it around, and try to get the last of that extract into the boil pot. And this is why I put gloves on. We've got the liquid malt extract in there, just a little bit more. Okay, we got the liquid malt extract in there. We got the dry malt extract. It's well mixed. Put both our gloves back on. Put this back on a burner. And now we're going to bring it back to a boil. Again, just because we have the Fermcap in there doesn't mean we can walk away from this. We're going to put this burner on high and we're going to keep an eye on it. If it starts to boil over, use your whisk or your spoon to stir it up a little bit and use your spray bottle of water. This is just straight filtered water, nothing fancy about that, to knock down the foam. Once we get back to a boil, we'll be right back. Okay, we're back to a boil. I've turned the heat down just to get it to a nice heavy simmer. You don't need a huge rolling boil for this. At this point, we can add our first bit of hops, which is the German Herzbrucker. We're going to add the entire 1 ounce package. Once we add that, keeping an eye on it, and as you can see, it wants to foam. And whoops, got to boil over. And that's what happens. So if that was on your kitchen stove, it'd be a mess. So you want to keep an eye on it. Looks like it actually put my flame out. We're going to stir that all back in. So that's what can happen. It even happens to me. Even with that Fermcap, you can see how quickly that got to a boil over. So you have to be careful. You have to be on it and pay attention to it. So now that we've added our hops, this is going to boil for 60 minutes. So I'm going to set my timer for 1 hour. And basically, this is just going to go for that 1 hour. And in about 40, or not about, in 40 minutes, we're going to add our second round of hops. 10 minutes later, we're going to add our last bit of hops and the remaining amount of liquid malt extract. So since you don't need to sit here and watch water boil, we'll break away and we'll cut back when we're ready to do our next addition. been 40 minutes into the boil. We've got 20 minutes left. So now it's time to add our first 1 ounce package of Czech Saaz or Saaz hops. We're going to open that package. And since we had a boil over last time, I'm going to grab my water bottle and keep an eye on this. Dump that in. And we had a little bit of a foam, but looks like we're good. So now we've got 10 more minutes. In 10 more minutes, we're going to add another 1 ounce of this hops, and we're going to add our last container of liquid malt extract. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. All right, we've got 10 minutes left in the boil. Now it's time to add our last bit of hops and our last container of liquid malt extract. To do that, because we're adding extract, we want to take the boil pot off the burner. So again, with your heavy-duty gloves, take it off the burner. Take our liquid malt extract, again, that has been sitting in nice warm water, so it's nice and soft. I've already removed the internal lid. We're going to pour that in and stir it as it's going in. Now, just like the first time we added liquid malt extract, we're going to put some hot water into the container and get all of the goodness into the bucket, into the boil pot. All right, all our liquid malt extract is in. It's all been well stirred. We're going to add our last ounce of hops. And now we're going to put it back on the burner and let it get back to a boil for the last 10 minutes. One last thing we're going to do is we're going to put our cooling coil into the pot so we can start sanitizing for the last 10 minutes. Now, normally I put this in with 15 minutes left to go, but because we had a 10-minute addition with the liquid malt extract and there was going to be some stirring involved, it's easier to do that with this not in the pot. So that's why I waited until now to add it to the pot. So that'll go in, and during the last 10 minutes of the boil, it will be sanitized. It's already been cleaned. Now it'll be sanitized. During these last few minutes, if you haven't already, now's the time to clean and rinse out your fermenter and anything else that's going to be used from this point on in the process. That could be your hydrometer, your thermometer, your lids, your bubblers, your funnel, whatever you're going to be using from this point on. Make sure that it's cleaned and rinsed, and during the cooling process is when we'll actually start sanitizing it. So you want your equipment ready to be sanitized when we're starting the cooling process. As you can see, not only do I have my cooling coil in here, but I do also have my whisk in there, and that's to sanitize the whisk because I'll be using that to stir during the cooling process. Now that the boil is done, we're going to turn off the burner. We're going to take our pot, again with our heat-resistant gloves, and we're going to put that onto the counter, get it off of the burner to help it cool down. My cooling coil is just connected to my outside spigot, nothing fancy, and then the other end actually runs down another hose all the way to my pool so I can save all the water. At this point, we're just going to turn on the cold water from my spigot, let it run through the coil, stir it a little bit to keep the liquid moving, and we'll cool it down. Okay, the cooling water is running through the coil. We're going to stir this up every so often to help speed up the cooling process. At this point, because we're doing a full quantity boil, we need to get this down to about 70 degrees. Under 75, definitely under 80 degrees before we put this into our fermentation bucket. This is the point where if you're doing a partial boil, there's a slight change here for you guys that are doing a partial boil. For a partial boil, you only need to get this down under 100 degrees. The reason being is you're going to put some very cold water into your fermentation bucket first, then pour this in, and that will help bring the temperature down. Because we have the full quantity here, I don't have the ability to cool it down with adding cold water because I have all 5.5 gallons here that are going to go into my fermentation bucket. So I need to get this liquid down to 75 degrees or so. At this point, it's a great opportunity for you to make sure that every piece of equipment that's going to come in contact with this wort at this point forward is sanitized. That includes your fermentation bucket of choice, your lid, your bubbler, your funnel if you're using one, your hydrometer, your thermometer, anything that could possibly come in contact with this wort from this point on needs to be sanitized. So this is an opportune time to take care of that while it's cooling. We'll be right back as soon as this gets down to temperature. While that continues to cool, you might be asking yourself, hey Chris, in the kit came 4 packets of hops, but we only used 3 of them during the process. You're right. The one packet of hops, Centennial hops, we have not used yet, and we're not going to be using that until much later in the process. After fermentation has happened and 5 days prior to bottling, we're going to put that into our fermentation bucket. Very carefully open your fermentation bucket and pour those in and dump that in, close up your lid and let it go. That's what's called dry hopping. We're going to get a lot of aroma and a lot of hop flavor out of it, but it's not going to import any bitterness. So just hold on to that package of hops, put it in the refrigerator, put it in the corner so you don't forget it, and make yourself a note that 5 days prior to bottling, you're going to want to put that into your fermentation bucket. We'll be back as soon as this is completely cooled. We're just about down to temperature that we can go ahead and put this into our fermentation bucket. Let's take one final temperature reading. I'm at 77 degrees, so we're close enough. We're going to take our hydrometer that has been cleaned and sanitized, and you can still see some of the sanitizer dripping off of that. We're going to put that in there, and we're going to get our measurement of our liquid at this point. So we're going to take a note as to what time it is. Currently, our hydrometer is reading 1.054 at a temperature of 77. So we're going to document that. 77 degrees, 1.054. And then later on, I'm going to actually go online to a calculator and adjust that because my hydrometer is calibrated at 60 degrees. Since the liquid is at 77, 1.054 is not exactly accurate. So we'll adjust that and put that in our notes. At this point, we're going to remove our hydrometer. We're going to take our cooling coil, remove that from our wort. Let that drip a little bit. I'm going to put that right into a bucket of cleaning solution along with my whisk. And at this point, we're just going to slowly pour this into our fermentation bucket. Fermentation bucket we're using today is a big mouth bubbler, 6.5 gallon with a spigot at the bottom. If you're using a fermenter that has a spigot at the bottom, make sure it's closed at this point. I've got a funnel and a strainer just to make life easier. And we're going to pour this liquid into my big mouth bubbler. Now this is a little heavy if you're using a full quantity like this. So pour slowly and carefully. Don't pour faster than your funnel will allow. Now this is going to do two things. This is going to slightly aerate it. This is going to pull out some of the hop material. You're still not going to have a really clear and clean wort at this point, and that's okay. All right, we've got all of it poured in. We've got just over 5 gallons, so we're good there. We're going to take this, put that back in our boil pot, and we'll clean that in a minute. Same with our funnel. All right, we got just over 5 gallons in our fermentation bucket, so we're good to go. Now what we need to do is we need to put our yeast into it. Our yeast packet has been sitting out on the counter for this entire time since we started brewing. I'm going to give it one last shake. I'm going to give it one last spritz of Star San in the corner that we're going to cut off. One last spritz of Star San on our scissors. Cut open the yeast packet and just pour it right in. Okay, our yeast is in. Now all we need to do is put the top on the fermentation vessel, which is that. Now, with big mouth bubblers and these lids, as you notice as I pushed it on, it kind of pops back up. So a little trick that I've used in the past is these little spring clamps. I believe they're 4-inch spring clamps, but I will put a link down below where you can pick these up on, I believe, Amazon. Just clip that onto the side, and that will hold the lid on. Now, just need to take our bubbler and our stopper, put that in the hole, put our cap on the bubbler, fill it with a little bit of Star San to the fill line. Okay, now we need to just put this away for the next 2 to 4 weeks in a cool, dark place. Cool is a relative term. This yeast performs best between 65 and 72 degrees. So if you have a location that is fairly temperature stable in that range, great, go for it. Put it in there. Might be a closet, might be a back corner of a room, whatever works for you. If the temperature is a little bit warmer, don't worry about it. The yeast will still perform. It just might have a slightly different flavor at the end of the process. At this point, all that's left to do is wait for this to ferment and clean up everything. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video today. I hope you've learned something throughout the video and possibly inspired you to jump on into the hobby of home brewing. If you have any comments or questions, go ahead and leave them in the comment section below. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to my channel and click the bell to be notified anytime I post a new video. While you're down there, go ahead and hit the thumbs up button for a like. Remember, home brewing is really fun, but so is drinking responsibly. I'm Coach Chris, and we'll see you next brew.